everyone, welcome back to the Grown Up Millennial. So a few months ago on my community tab, I was asking for video suggestions and someone asked me to speak about the FIRE movement, which surprised me, but I'm super excited to talk about it. So excited that I waited 3 or 4 whole months to get around to making this video. Been busy. YouTube is not my job. So what is FIRE? FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And it's a growing movement among Gen Xers, millennials, and even some Gen Z. And the idea is to be in a place financially where you no longer have to work for an income. Now, some folks choose to no longer work, hence the retire early part, whereas others might choose to start a small business, do more passion jobs that maybe don't make nearly as much money as their older jobs do, might do more volunteer work, they might choose to work part-time or do more travel, etc. But the general idea is to come to a place financially where you have a lot more flexibility in how you can live your life. Now, I personally am actually a pretty big fan of the FIRE movement. I do read a couple different blogs on it. I do follow a fair amount of the principles and know a fair amount about it. However, there are some legitimate criticisms of the FIRE movement as well. So we're going to cover those criticisms before getting into some of the benefits and why I am such a fan of this movement. But first, some of the mechanics. How does one become financially independent? Well, the basic idea is that you earn an income from a normal job or maybe even a small business, and you spend part of that income, but the remainder, the part that you didn't spend, you invest. And these investments are usually going to be something like real estate or putting it into the stock market. And over time, those investments generate income. So as you build your investments, eventually they should generate enough income such that they are the same or higher than your expenses. So the point at which your passive income from investments is equal to or higher than your expenses, then you're considered financially independent. It's the same basic idea as retirement, except for you're not necessarily relying on things like Social Security or pensions. It's all completely self-funded. And of course, usually at a much younger age, anywhere from, early 60s all the way down to your mid 20s or early 30s. But that's the basic idea behind the FIRE movement. So I would say one of the biggest criticisms of FIRE is that it doesn't work for everybody. Often people say that it's generally popular among middle class or high middle class folks, particularly tech workers in places like Silicon Valley, white folks, men, particularly young men, etc. And I think that can be true. Particularly a lot of the leaders of the FIRE movement tend to be these younger tech workers or doctors, people who tend to generate a very high income so they can retire at an incredibly young age, because if they live just even like a really basic, simple lifestyle, they have a lot of money left over to invest. So these are often the ones that become the most popular. However, the movement has definitely grown to include a much more diverse group of people. But ultimately, the criticism is that it really doesn't work for people on a low income, minimum wage, below the poverty line, etc. And that's true. If you are living on a minimum wage, then you really don't have a lot of income left over to invest. However, the criticism that advice needs to be able to apply to everybody to be good advice is silly, to be honest. For example, let's take one of my most popular videos, which is my $20 a week grocery shopping video. If you've seen that video, you know that I spent a lot of time talking about, that your mileage may vary. You may eat more meat than I do, you might live in a different area, etc. That you might not be able to do the $20 a week grocery shopping like I was able to do. But I still get comments all the time talking about, I can't get those prices where I live, or I'm on food stamps, or I weigh twice as much as you, I couldn't possibly do this, or I couldn't imagine not eating meat every day, etc. But does that mean because this advice wasn't helpful to those people that I shouldn't have made the video at all? I think we can agree that would be silly. So yes, FIRE isn't necessarily helpful for folks living on minimum wage. Doesn't mean it's not a useful movement. Second criticism is that expenses are unpredictable, and how do you know when you've truly fired? Again, I think this can be a valid criticism. You could be healthy now, but way down the line have a really expensive medical event. Or maybe you don't have kids when you fire and then you do have kids. Maybe your kid has a special needs or has a big medical event of their own. Maybe there's an earthquake and you have to fix your house and it costs a lot more than you thought. Whatever it is, expenses are unpredictable. So yeah, that's valid. Expenses are unpredictable, and it can be hard to figure out at what point are you safe. That's part of the reason a lot of folks in the FIRE movement suggest an additional cushion. So most don't say, hey, your income is exactly the same as your expenses, you should quit your job and never work again right at that moment. Normally the idea is to work a couple of extra years and build up a cushion, to be flexible. So maybe this particular expense goes up this year, but you're able to cut back on that expense. So it is something that the FIRE movement addresses to some degree, but you know, you can't predict everything. The third criticism is really similar, except in that your income is unpredictable. So when you're relying on things like investments from the stock market or real estate, those things have ups and downs. We all lived through the 2008 financial crisis, or maybe even the 2000 dot-com bust, or stagflation in the 70s, what have you. We know that the economy is kind of cyclical, and there are good times and there are bad times. So what if, while you're trying to live off of your investments, a tsunami wipes out all of your real estate, or the market loses 50% and you need the money right now? Again, the FIRE movement addresses this in a couple ways. First being, again, having that cushion, so not one relying on a single investment, trying to diversify so that if one investment goes down, another can sort of take its place. Having more investments than you would need, again, so that when things contract, you still have enough to live on. But also this idea of what's called the safe withdrawal rate. So this is, I believe, based on the Trinity study, where they found for any 30-year period, you could safely withdraw about 4% of your assets to live on per year, and your nest egg would remain intact such that you could live off of this the entire 30-year period. So the FIRE movement talks about, relies on this safe withdrawal rate, which is, again, about 4%. But again, you don't know what you don't know. The final criticism is a little bit more nebulous, but again, I think can be very valid, and that is social isolation. Got it. One thing you often hear about the FIRE movement is, oh, so I'm gonna live broke so that I can retire broke. Basically the idea of these people like really nickel and diming and like essentially living in a cardboard box so that they can continue to live in the cardboard box for the rest of their life, but hey, they're retired and they don't have to work. But we also have recent stories over the last couple years. As FIRE has become more popular, we do hear these stories of people who they retired early and they didn't like it. Usually this is for a couple reasons. Usually because they were really looking forward to spending a lot more time with their friends, but all their friends still work, so they spent a lot of time alone just around the house. Or folks that did what's called geo-arbitrage, which is where they moved from a high cost of living city where they made a great income to a lower cost of living city. But it meant they moved away from a lot of their family and friends and lost important social ties. Or even that they didn't really have a plan for what they were going to do after retirement, that they just didn't want to work anymore. We also have issues during the phase where you are saving up to retire, where maybe people aren't going out very much, they're not being very social, and they even feel this guilt about spending any money. Again, those are all valid points, but a lot of it is just issues with frugality in general, is trying to strike that balance between doing some saving and investing and preparing for your future financially while still enjoying the moment and paying for experiences and goods and services that matter to you. So those are the criticisms. What are the benefits? I mean, some of the benefits are obvious, right? You have a bunch of money saved up, you don't have to work in a job you dislike anymore, flexibility, etc. And obviously, as a normal person, I find those incredibly attractive. However, to me, a lot of the benefits of FIRE are more of kind of the values you have to take on to get there. So let's go through those. The first benefit is reduced consumption. So naturally, to spend less than you make and have enough money left over to invest, you're gonna have to consume less stuff and services. And as an environmentalist, I love that. If the whole planet consumed resources the same way Americans do, we would need 4 Earths to feed that. As it is, we just generally as a planet, particularly as Americans, consume way too many resources. So anything that is encouraging folks to consume less resources, whether that's using less energy, buying less stuff, buying less new stuff, or being just more mindful in general of what you're spending your money on, I'm all for that. There's a reason that FIRE often goes hand in hand with things like minimalism. The second big benefit is a focus on what matters and a rejection of traditional success. So often in America, what we think of as signs of a really successful person are a really fancy car, a big beautiful house, eating out all the time, lavish vacations all over the world, etc. And FIRE sort of flips that on its head and focusing more on practicality and more on experiences and social ties rather than stuff. And understanding that that stuff means trading more of your time to earn money to pay for them. So instead of spending an extra 5 years working at a job I don't like to have a fancy car, I choose to have a simple car, or in my case, I don't have a car. Well, me and my husband have a car, but I got rid of what was my car almost 2 years ago. But really the idea is changing what success looks like. That success is more being able to do what you want and work on more meaningful projects and spend your time in a way that feels more meaningful to you. But also, again, just focusing on what matters is emphasizing time with family or volunteer opportunities or following passions more than designer clothes, big houses, fancy cars, etc. What I find really helpful about this personally is really focusing on what I actually want out of something. So for me, whenever I go out, it's less for the food and more because I want to hang out with a particular friend. So what matters in that transaction is hanging out with a person, not necessarily where we go. So that means now I know what part of that actually matters to me. So instead of spending a ton of money on a really big meal, we might focus on going to a happy hour or even invite them over and we'll have a board night and drink wine and have great food here, go to their house, and focus on less expensive activities while still getting the part of the transaction that I actually cared about. You know, I might think I need to go out, but I'm not going out because I desperately want to be in that restaurant. I want to go out because I missed that friend, or I want to hang out with my husband, or I've got really cool parents and I want to hang out with them. So that's a big part of focusing on what matters and flipping the sense of success that I think could be helpful to most people. Number 3 is reducing or eliminating debt. So a big part of FIRE is not only saving a bunch of money, but also reducing your debt, usually in the form of student loans, car debt, credit cards, personal loans, etc. And I think that's just a good idea for most people. Again, obviously not everyone can do these aggressive, rapid debt pay downs, but I think most people would be better off if they carried less debt and were able to pay it off or focused on paying it off, and then didn't have to deal with those payments and then could later invest the money they were originally sending to debt. Number 4 is flexibility. Now, chances are most people can't retire early, but most people can benefit from more money. Let's say you need $1 million to retire, which would be about $40,000 a year in expenses that would be covered. Very general, we're not worrying so much about taxes. Maybe you never get to $1 million, you only get to $300,000 or $500,000. I mean, are you gonna say no to having $300,000 or $500,000 that you didn't have before? No, not really. So that's the thing about FIRE is if you find out along the way that it doesn't work for you, you're not in a losing position. You now have some flexibility. Maybe you can put a down payment on a house. Maybe you can do some travel while still working your job. Maybe you have an emergency fund you desperately need when one of those unexpected expenses come up. Maybe you decide to raise kids and one of the parents decides they want to be a stay-at-home parent. All options, all flexible options that maybe you didn't retire early, but by pursuing the values of FIRE, where you spend less than you make and you invest it and you pay down debt and you focus on what matters, now you were able to do those things where you wouldn't have if you had followed a more traditional consumerist type setup. Final benefit is a focus on active hobbies as opposed to more passive hobbies. So active hobbies are going to be things that require engagement from your brain or your hands or really get you out and moving, like playing a sport or playing an instrument, hiking, making art, cooking, etc. Whereas a passive hobby would be something that doesn't really require much engagement from you. Listening to music, watching TV or going to the movies, going to concerts, watching sports. It's a lot of watching because again, it doesn't require engagement from you. And while passive hobbies can be cheap, I mean, it doesn't cost much to sit and watch TV, it doesn't really do much for you. It doesn't help keep you healthy. It doesn't help feed your soul. It often doesn't do much. So FIRE tends to focus and emphasize having these active hobbies, things that get you out and moving because they tend to be healthier, they tend to be better for our brains. And oftentimes they're things that you could maybe turn into a side hustle. If you love hiking, maybe you lead hiking groups or you volunteer like that. Or, if you love to crochet, maybe you start to sell some stuff on Etsy. If you love to cook, you're saving money over eating out. If you love to garden, that's less food you have to buy from the grocery store, what have you. So I think, it's not bad to have some passive hobbies. My husband and I have several shows that we love to watch. We do, I watch YouTube because I'm addicted. I like to read, which some folks consider to be kind of passive, but we also have active hobbies. We love to go hiking and we bike around our neighborhood. We walk our dog. I cook a lot. We garden. We do a lot of DIY stuff on our house, which I think is kind of a hobby in and of itself. And I think in general, most folks could benefit from developing more active hobbies as opposed to passive hobbies. So those are my thoughts on the FIRE movement. I'm generally pretty supportive. Am I gonna retire super early? Probably not, but I hope, maybe in my 50s instead of my 60s. That'd be pretty cool. Hell, maybe late 40s. That'd be great. But in the meantime, I really enjoy the tenets of FIRE, and I think even if most people can't retire early in and of themselves, they would benefit from less consumption, having a little bit more money saved, less debt, and having more active hobbies, and just generally focusing more on things that matter and build social ties, as opposed to building a life that looks great but isn't necessarily fun to live. Now I want to hear your thoughts. What did you think about FIRE? Have you ever heard of it before this video? Is it something that you'd be interested in yourself, or could you just not imagine being retired? Do you disagree with me on any of the benefits? Do any of these things sound awesome to you or just horrible, not for you at all? Let me know in the comments below. Love to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, I guess. Yeah, I'd like that. So a few months ago, really? Do you want to come up? Thank you. Back to to the grown-up millennial. Hi. Hi, I know. I know. What am I doing? What am I doing not touching you? Which surprised me, but you... Really, Ted? Really? Stop! Come here. Thank you. We're gonna stop barking at the car, okay? I was going somewhere with that.